Hello, welcome to the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. My name is Jack Ashby, and I'm going to give you a quick little highlights tour of the amazing collections we have here at the Museum of Zoology. We have around 2 million specimens in our collection, covering the whole of the animal kingdom, around 500 million years of animal life, and covering the whole of the world. I'm going to start our little tour outside the museum with the very biggest thing in our collection. As you enter the Museum of Zoology, when you look up, the first thing you'll see above your head is the largest museum object in Cambridge, and it is the skeleton of a fin whale. Now, fin whales are the second largest animal in the world after the blue whale, and they're really extraordinary. The way they feed is extraordinary because despite being so big, they only eat tiny, tiny animals, and we can see how they do that by looking at our huge skeleton outside the museum's galleries here. Now, it's a beautiful sunny day here in Cambridge, as always. You've got it wonderfully lit from behind with the blue sky in the background. So this is the skull, and that at the bottom of the skull is its jaw. The whale's jaw is actually the longest bone in the animal kingdom. And inside those jaws, hanging from the roof of the mouth, are these brown brush-like structures. They're called baleen, and this is how whales eat. Now, a big whale, like a blue whale or a fin whale, take a massive gulp of water, which actually expands their bodies up to about twice its volume. They can expand, they can hold water all the way down to their belly buttons in these long, pleated structures that you see on their throat. And with all that water in their mouth, they then push it back out with those muscular pleats, and they push it through these baleen sieve-like plates, and it catches tiny shrimp-like animals called krill and fish and squids, and then having pushed all the water out, all they have to do is lick around the inside of these baleen plates and gulp the masses of food that is left in their mouths. Now, there are amazing skeletons in other ways, and one of my favorite skeletons is talking about the evolution of life. So, again, backlit against the sun, we can see its fin skeleton here. Now, fin whales only have 4 fingers, a lot of other whales have 5, but you can see that its hands, despite not having gripping hands like ours, its fins have got the same hand skeletons. It's got the same bones in its fingers, the same wrist bones, it's got a radius and ulnar, it's got a humerus, it's got a shoulder blade, which is exactly the same layout as ours. And that is because it's a mammal much like us. And if we go further down the skeleton, we can see my very favorite bones in the whole of the animal kingdom. These 2 rods that we're coming up under now, those are its pelvis. Now, as you probably know, the pelvis connects your spine to your legs, but whales do not have legs. Nevertheless, they have a pelvis, and that's because they evolved from animals that did have legs. They evolved from animals that walked on land, most closely related to hippos. And the evidence we can see of that is these 2 remaining tiny little bits of bone hanging underneath its skeleton. Now, our fin whale came to the museum in 1865, which is the first time I'm going to mention that year on this tour. 1865 is a very important year for us for a number of reasons. An important year for the whale too, because that's the year that it died. It beached in a bay in East Sussex and brought to the museum shortly afterwards. But that same year was one of the founding years for the museum, depending on how we count. So the museum is a conglomeration of 2 different collections. The first of that is the university's teaching collection. The museum is embedded in the Department of Zoology, and it's a very, very important part of the university. And now, ever since 1814, the university's been keeping an anatomical collection, and the first parts of that are the very earliest parts of the museum collection. The other part of our museum comes from the collection of the Cambridge Philosophical Society, which was founded just over 200 years ago in 1819 by kind of gentlemen scholars who lived in Cambridge, who wanted to come together as a society to talk about their scientific ideas. And they formed a collection which they ran out of space for, also in 1865. And that is the year that the museum came together as the university's teaching collection and research collection and the Cambridge Philosophical Society's collection was brought together onto the site here in the new museum site off Downing Street in Cambridge in 1865. And the first object inside the gallery that I want to talk to you about is perhaps one of the most famous in history of life, and that is this one here. It's the dodo. So dodos are a real icon of extinction. They're probably the first species that people in the West realized that they had themselves driven to extinction. Now, it certainly isn't the first species that people drove to extinction, but as I say, possibly the first that they realized that they drove to extinction. Now, here at the Museum of Zoology, we have possibly the most complete skeleton of a dodo, the one on the brown one on the left, in the world. So possibly the most complete. However, it is a composite. So that means it is an amalgamation of many different dodo bones and from many different individuals. And you might have noticed if you've ever been to a museum and seen other dodo bones, they're nearly always brown. And that is because 99% or more of the world's dodo material, including ours, was collected in 1865, the same year that our whale died, and the same year that the museum's founding collections were brought together. The dodos were collected in 1865 by, or under the supervision of a school teacher called George Clark on the island of Mauritius, where they once lived. And he asked and paid people in Mauritius to go wading through a swamp called the Mare Sange to feel with their bare feet for the bones of a dodo. And those collections is where pretty much every dodo in the world, every dodo bone in the world comes from, with the exception of these few little scraps in front. Now, these are all plaster casts of a skull from a museum in Denmark, a beak from a museum in Prague, and a head from a museum in Oxford, and a foot that was once at the Natural History Museum in London. Those are the only specimens that were collected from dodos before they went extinct. And dodos are, I say, a really iconic species in extinction because they were found on the island of Mauritius up until the 1660s. Now, Dutch, French, Portuguese, and Flemish sailors started visiting Mauritius about 90 years before that. And within those 90 years, dodos were driven to extinction, partly because they had evolved to not fly. So they're a species of pigeon that had arrived on Mauritius, found that it had no predators, lots and lots of fruit, no need to fly. They were doing absolutely fine until people arrived around the turn of the 17th century and very quickly hunted them to extinction. As well as that, they introduced cats and dogs and mice and rats and goats, which ate their eggs and trampled their nests, and it ate their nestlings. And within those 90 years, they were driven to extinction. So all we have now is museums to find dodos in. Similarly, next to it, this white specimen is a skeleton of the great auk. Now, great auks are another icon of extinction. Having been driven to extinction in 1844, they were collected for their oil and their feathers, and they, again, only exist in museums. Now, this one here at the Museum of Zoology in Cambridge is a very important great auk because it is the skeleton from which the major scientific description of the great auk was made. I'm just going to walk you through some of our fish collections to tell you another story about the important research that the collection has been involved in. The museum is constantly being used in scientific research, and we have an amazing research collection, as I say, of over 2 million specimens. In the museum, we have an incredibly important collection of fossils, which are quite hard to look at, but they tell us an incredibly important story about how life evolved on land, how vertebrate life, how animals with bones evolved on land. And a lot of that work was down to our former professor of vertebrate paleontology, who was called Jenny Clack, Professor Jenny Clack. She researched particularly this specimen here. This is called Acanthostega, which is about 360 million years old, which Jenny found on an expedition in Greenland. And Acanthostega is interesting because it's an animal she thinks lived in the sea, that looked like this, and yet it had legs very much like animals that would later evolve life on land. But you might be able to spot that it's got more than 5 digits. It's possible that the earlier fish-like tetrapods, the earlier animals that would evolve to be 4-legged animals on land, had more than 5 digits. And this fossil here from Greenland, as I say, has got these digits at the very bottom of the skeleton, along with its arm bones, which have, much like us, have a humerus, a radius, and an ulna. And there's its skull, which is separate from its spine. So the fact that it has a neck is also very important because it allows for independent movement of the head. These are all things that Jenny Clack helped to research and help us our understanding of how life evolved on land here in the museum. Now we're filming on a day that the museum is closed to the public and that we've been doing a lot of install work, so you'll see there might be some cases open and there might be a lot of equipment being left around. I'm just going to talk you through a few of my favourite cases as we enter the upper gallery. And that starts with this one, which is talking about how taxidermy is made. Well, when people think of museum display specimens, taxidermy is one of the most common ones. But it isn't actually what most specimens in museums look like. Most specimens in museums, if they're used for research, might look like something like this. So here is the flat skin of an otter shrew, so that's just an animal that's been skinned and the skin has been left flat. Or alternatively, here is the study skin of a bush baby, which has basically been had all its innards removed, and those innards have been replaced with packing material. So it's kind of just like a stuffed sock. So this is a stuffed animal. We call it a study skin. These are much more useful for research. But the taxidermy that you more commonly associate with museums is a much more complex process. Because of course, when animals die, this is not how they look. The skin has to be removed, and all of the taxidermist's work is to recreate the inside structure of the animal and then shape the skin around it. So people might call these stuffed animals, but it's really much more complex than that. What they have to do is to remove the insides and then rebuild them around a solid, stable structure like a wooden frame or a metal frame that might be running through its legs. And then with padding shapes like textiles or binding together wood, wool and straw, create the shapes of all the different muscle packages and then shape the skin around that, adding glass eyes and paint any naked bits of skin. With animals with horns, those horns then have to be added back on top again because they are part of the skull. Or similarly, we've got a golden eagle down here. Now this is the study skin of a golden eagle. This is what it would look like in our stored research collections. That's the majority of our 2 million collections are in store. Whereas the golden eagle here has been beautifully taxidermied again, had all those inner packages of muscle rebuilt and its legs and naked bits of skin painted. That's much harder to do than just storing the flat skin, and they take up much more space. So our study collection, our research collection, looks more like those skins here. Similarly, with bone, when an animal dies, of course, this is what our stored skeletal collections look like. Just boxes of loose bones. These are much more useful for researching because we can measure each bone, we can see how they fitted together. Whereas on display, you're much more likely to see a complete skeleton like this ostrich here. Again, this takes up much more space. It's also open to human interpretation. This is a person-built object. So someone has, like the taxidermy, strung these bones together. You can see the wire that's holding them and the scaffold that's supporting them. So that means that they're not necessarily as useful for research as the box of bones. And our final group of specimen preservation types here that we are displaying is this case of beautiful fluid preserved specimens. This is when the entire body of the animal is preserved in fluid. Now to do this, it's quite a complex chemical process. The first thing you have to do is fix the animal so that it stops rotting completely. And that's done with a very nasty chemical, a fixative, often formalin, which stops the contents of the cells from rotting and binds them all together. And then after they've been fixed, they can be preserved in an alcohol, like preservative, and that's what's in these jars. And in these cases, these specimens can stay in this suspended animation whole, so we know what their organs, how the organs relate to their skeletons if they have them inside their bodies. They can stay this way for a couple of 100 years. So these are 3 different preservation types that we show in the museum: wet specimens, skeletons, and taxidermy. But we discuss how they are different to the collections that are behind the scenes. We're now going to go downstairs to look at some of the more highlighted parts of the collection. And I mentioned the museum came together from the Cambridge Philosophical Society and the university's own collection. Now, because of the Cambridge Philosophical Society, we have collections from some of the most important scientists in the history of biology, and perhaps the most famous zoologist is Charles Darwin, who was a student here at Cambridge, and that means that we have a very large collection, one of the largest collections of Darwin material in the world, in the Museum of Zoology, and a lot of it is on display. In fact, we can tell a little biographical story of Darwin through our collection, starting with those student years. So this box of beetles is a collection that Charles Darwin made whilst he was a student at Cambridge. Now, Charles was not a very good student, it has to be said. Instead of going to his lectures, he would go out into the fens and fields around Cambridgeshire and develop his love for beetles. This is what he did in his student years rather than going to lectures, is collect and pin beetles. And there's a very famous story where he had a beetle that he very much wanted in one hand, a beetle that he very much wanted in another hand, but he saw a third beetle. So in order to try and get hold of that one too, he put one of the beetles in his hands into his mouth, at which point it exploded its defensive fluid all over his tongue, and it made him splutter and sick and cough, and he lost all 3 specimens. So this is a little insight to Darwin's student days, but most famous obviously is Darwin's work on his theory of evolution. And a lot of that, the evidence for that theory, came on the voyage of the Beagle, which Darwin undertook for 5 years from 1831. It's actually the only time he left the country. On the voyage of the Beagle, he collected a huge amount of natural history specimens. And when he came back, he partitioned them off to different specialists to describe what kinds of animals they thought they were. And here in Cambridge, a gentleman called Leonard Jennings got the fish from the voyage of the Beagle. So these are fishes collected by Charles Darwin, mostly around South America in the 1830s. Now, most people have never heard of Leonard Jennings. He's very, very important in our museum history. He collected many hundreds of beetles and insects from around Cambridgeshire, which we're now using to help rebuild an idea of what the habitats around Cambridgeshire look like in order to form the conservation of habitats around Cambridgeshire. But kind of Jennings is an interesting footnote in history of biology, because he was the first person that the captain of the Beagle asked to be the naturalist on board. And Jennings said, no, why don't you ask Charles Darwin? Which they did. Darwin said yes, and the rest is history. If Jennings had said, yes, I will come on the Beagle, rather than collecting the specimens we have in the museum today, the world might be quite different. So we're quite grateful that he did. Nonetheless, we have those Darwin materials. But perhaps the even more famous objects that came back from the Beagle are the Galapagos finches. Now, these appear in Darwin's work as one of the most clear pieces of evidence for his evolutionary thinking, because they're a group of 14 different birds that all appear to have evolved from a single ancestor, but they have different specializations for different foods on the islands in the Galapagos. The one on the right has got we can see here, it's got a very, very fine bill, which might be for picking seeds or insects out of flower heads. This one here's parrot-shaped bill, has got a massive crushing bill, which would be for eating seeds and crushing open thick seeds. Now, these birds are often called Darwin's finches, but actually Darwin perhaps shouldn't be credited for the most important pieces of work here, partly because these are not Darwin's finches. These are not the finches that Darwin collected on the Galapagos Islands. They are in fact collected by the Beagle's captain, Fitzroy, and his mate, his apprentice, Fuller. And Fitzroy and Fuller properly labelled their specimens as to which islands they came from, so that when John Gould looked at them when Darwin handed them over, they were much more useful than the birds that Darwin had collected, because he knew where they came from. And it was Gould that said, hey Darwin, what do you think about these all being the same kind of bird but with different kinds of beak? So it was really, we call them Galapagos finches, because these beagle finches were actually not collected by Darwin. And it wasn't necessarily Darwin that realized their initial significance as much as he put his work to them later. And when Darwin returned to England from the Beagle, he set about his work establishing himself as a biologist. He was initially trained far more in geology, and he thought, I need to prove myself as a biologist and before anyone will take me seriously. And what we have here is how he went about doing that. These are his slides from his dissections of barnacles. He worked for 8 years dissecting barnacles to try and teach us everything as much as possible that we know about barnacles today. And he thought in doing that, people might take him more seriously. Now, talking about evolution and Darwin, we might then also talk about extinction. And this is one of my very favorite specimens in the whole museum. It's a little known animal, but certainly not a little animal. It's called Diprotodon. And my favorite kinds of animals, what animals I work on, are Australian mammals. And this is the largest ever marsupial. So just to give you a sense of scale, if I move along a bit, here is a rhinoceros. This is one of the largest animals alive today, 2.5 tons. Very much the same size, similar size, is Diprotodon. So this animal, unfortunately, is extinct. It lived in Australia until about 50,000 years ago, and it was a relative of the wombat. The wombats are my second favorite animal, and this is the skeleton of a wombat. They weigh 20 or 30 kilos. It was living 50,000 years or so ago, was Diprotodon, which could weigh over 2.5 tons. As I say, the largest ever marsupial. Sadly, they went extinct soon after humans arrived in Australia, and that is a major possible theory for why they became extinct. And that sadly is a theme that we see in other parts of the museum. So here in this tool case is the leg of a moa. Moas were 3 to 4 meter tall flightless birds that lived on the islands of New Zealand until humans arrived 700 or 800 years ago. In fact, in the collection here we have feathers of moas that were alive 700 or 800 years ago. Until 700 or 800 years ago. This giant skeleton here is that of a giant sloth. Now, as I say, when I was a student here studying in the museum, I came into the collection every day, into the galleries every day, and I'd see this giant sloth. But it wasn't until I started working here on my very first day, when I was writing labels for the objects, that I realized, hang on a second, this is a real giant sloth. Now, real giant sloths are extremely rare in museums. This is the only one on display in the UK. It's one of only 2 in the whole of Europe. And these animals are absolutely incredible. They weighed up to 4 tons, so again, a similar size to an elephant. It's one of the largest land mammals that has ever lived. And they lived in South America until just 12,000 years ago. That's a blink of an eye in geological terms. And it's the same story. As soon as humans arrived in South America, these giant animals disappeared. And unfortunately, we have a lot of extinct and endangered animals in the museum. But that does allow us to do a lot of research into helping with conservation. The very last thing I'm going to finish on is this absolutely incredible specimen here of a narwhal. Now, narwhals are Arctic whales, which the males of which have typically one enormous tusk growing through their front lip. It's normally just the left tusk. It's a spiral, and they're often said to be the origin of the unicorn myth. Now, our narwhal is particularly special because it has 2 tusks. Now, this is, we believe, happens in about 1 in 500 male narwhals might end up with 2 tusks. And it goes to show that museums very often have the unusual examples of a species. They have the outliers. So rather than museum specimens being the very typical examples of their species, they are often the unusual ones. Now, the kind of million-dollar question is, what is a narwhal tusks for? Now, as I say, mostly just the males have them, which normally suggests that it's got something to do with sexual competition, so choosing mates. And there have been a lot of fanciful tales of people saying that narwhal tusks are used for fighting, perhaps like antlers, like our giant deer here, or tusks, like our elephants here. However, there's no evidence that narwhals use their tusks for fighting. People have said that they might fence with them, sword fight with them, but that's never been seen. People say they might help catch fish, that they could whip them around a fish, much like a thin saber, and that would stun the fish. Now that has been observed, but it's curious that why the females wouldn't need them to do that. Very recent research suggests that actually, much like our teeth, these narwhal tusks might actually be sensory organs. So if you ever have painful teeth when you eat particularly hot or cold foods, we know that our teeth can be sense organs, that they can feel sensations from the environment. Now, narwhal tusks have been shown to be able to detect changes in salt levels in the sea. Now, as they live in the Arctic, this is very, very important, because if the sea gets saltier, that means that the surface of the ocean is freezing, because only fresh water freezes in the ocean. So the fresh water freezes, which makes the concentration of salt more obvious, and the narwhals can detect this. And the idea is that then, if they sense the sea is freezing, the males will lead the whole pod away from the freezing area so that they can breathe, because of course narwhals, like our fin whale out the front, are mammals and therefore need to breathe. So I'm going to finish that still quick tour of some of the highlights of the museum. Hope you've enjoyed it. I hope that you find the opportunity to come and visit us in the museum properly at some point in the future. Thanks very much.